Всем привет. How's everybody doing? How are you doing there?
Hello, Yuda. Nice seeing you again, and
It's a
welcome
pleasure.
to Rusar.
Ruske зарубежье. That's what we're all about.
Yeah, Ruski Zarubezhye, Russia Tsar. Ah, Russia Tsar is good.
Yeah, but again, not the czar with the
Right,
crown on
not
the
that
head,
Tsar.
but зарубежье.
You
Anyway,
never know. One will never know.
well, then we get political all of a sudden. Now we're in trouble because then all of the Republican Russians are going to get upset at us, right?
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Don't forget
Anyway,
Burgos. Yeah.
so I think the first thing we need to do is we need to thank all of the viewers that have liked and subscribed to our channel. That's really, what most importantly, of course, is when people watch our content, not just watch 2 seconds of it, but try to watch as much as possible. Hopefully it's interesting. That's why we're doing it, right?
Well, even skip through it. Just go a little bit. If you don't like what you hear, maybe just skip a little bit. But you'll hear a lot of interesting points. And again, we're looking for comments. Don't forget to comment. Don't be shy. So if this episode is about still Russians in Upper Manhattan, West Harlem, or Hamilton Heights, uh, if your relatives, family, friends, grandparents, uncles, whatever, right, babushki, dedushki, if they live there, just comment there. Comment anywhere where we post this video, right? 141st Street and so on. We don't need the official address, but at least to understand, because we're trying to pinpoint all of this information. And we've been, again, thank you for those who have been actually reacting in various ways via emails or text or on Telegram, on YouTube. So it's really, thank you all for sharing that information.
Absolutely. That's been really great. It really pushes us to do an even better job. And with that in mind, in our last segment on Russians who are from Upper Manhattan, we discussed the origins of those Russians, where they came from, who they were, and the fact that they came here probably through the Tolstoy Foundation. Just a brief word on that. The Tolstoy Foundation was founded by Alexander Tolstoy, the famous writer Leo Tolstoy's daughter, and she played a very big role in refugee resettlement from Europe during World War II and afterward as well. So it was thanks to Alexander Tolstoy that many, many Russian Americans came here and built their new home here in the United States. We discussed the fact that Russian Americans came there, and the interesting thing is that Kato's been doing some more research in the interim, and you discovered an interesting thing about when Russian Americans showed up in uptown Manhattan. Previously, we were thinking, well, they must have been pretty much there from the 50s onward, but what did you discover?
No, in reality, again, going through various newspapers, American newspapers for that matter, New York City newspapers, and Novoye Ruske Slovo, we've got articles where all the way from 1920, right? So, or advertisements, right? Dating back to 1920, 1931. I mean, actually, all years. So, but again, who were they? They were Russians. I'm focusing on Russians, right? I don't know какое их вероисповедание. I don't know if they were Jewish or Orthodox, but these addresses are all a lot again spread over New York. But again, New York's been getting upper West Harlem area. There's a lot of interesting addresses attached to it.
Absolutely.
It keeps on growing.
I think one of the number one things that we were able to determine is that there were actually Russian Orthodox Christians that were in that area pre-World War II, which is kind of something I didn't expect to find. Many of them, because in that interbellum period from World War I to World War II, there were not really that many Russian emigres that came from Russia at that period directly to the United States. Most of them were in Europe. They wanted to live close to Russia because they were expecting maybe things would change in their favor and they would be able to return. Okay, so that's why I was a little surprised. And the first indication we had of that was the Russian Orthodox Church of the Holy Fathers that's currently on 153rd Street originally moved to that address before World War II. It moved just a little bit away from where the current church building is. It was in a laundromat, which I actually filmed, and it was in that little laundromat. It originally originated on between 128th and 129th Street on Fifth Avenue in Eastern Harlem, essentially, or like close to Eastern Harlem. That's where it originally was from. What's where it started, and then 1938, it moves up to 153rd Street. Why? Well, I guess the answer is because there was enough people there that were willing to attend services up there already
Right.
before the war.
Yep. Yeah, there was a lot of kvartiere, a lot of apartments, rooms for rent. We're focusing mostly on the Ruskiy Zarubezhye of the Orthodox faith, right? But still, there the Russian Jews, and that was that was from the 40s and onwards to 108th, and 108th is where Kiselyov. I don't know what year Kiselyov opened up his church. I don't know.
I don't know either. We'll have to find out. But there's it's a beautiful building, by the way, and I also have film of that.
There was a church on 77th, right, where my parents got married, Synodalная Церковь.
So there were a bunch of churches, including one also. There was a Russian church in this one article described that was on 121st Street. Unfortunately, I don't see any traces of it now. There just appears to be a school there. Cool. So maybe they took the building down and, they could have built that school there in its place. But very interesting that you did have Russians in East Harlem as well. No trace of that now, of course. But again, the Holy Father's Church on 153rd Street, that is probably the only memento of Russian Orthodox Christians living in uptown Manhattan to this day.
Oh, one thing, let me remind you, right? I told you about my mom. She was somehow attached to this one church because it was fairly nearby, right? It was a Presbyterian church. Pray, venerate an icon that was there. I remember all this as a kid. I remember we would walk over there.
Well, I think one important thing to point out is the fact that, first of all, it's not that they attended the divine services of these churches, but they, like, for example, my grandmother would take me. I have a cave of the Nativity, a big life-size cave of the Nativity in my neighborhood, and my grandmother would always take me by there, and we would pray there. And it was because, again, all of these churches of other denominations, they had enough staff to keep the church open throughout the day, so you could just walk in there and and it doesn't mean that they were participating in the services of these other churches, but they were just venerating things like icons and stuff like that. That was a practice that people definitely did. And so getting back to Russians who lived in that area, I think that what's interesting is that what makes a community? What makes a community is that there are not only people living there, but there are also businesses there, and we're going to discuss that in just 1 minute. But one thing we need to also figure out, last time we did our podcast, we designated one building as the Ruski Dom. That's the building that my father grew up in, 3456 Broadway off of 141st Street, West 141st. There is no East Streets there because they continue on in the Bronx. So that's the place I thought was the Ruski Dom. Then, in our correspondence, it turns out there's more than one Ruski Dom. The building right across the street, where a little Katolhichinov grew up, spent his youngest years there, that is 561 Broadway. It's a 10-story building right across from 3456 Broadway. Many Russians living there, as you very well know. Yeah. And then there's two more buildings that are on 145th Street, okay, which is a major two-way street. And then also what's interesting is that initially when Russians came there, a lot of them lived on 139th Street because they would only be renting rooms there. They wouldn't be renting full apartments. Right. So that was the initial place where a lot of people just dropped their luggage essentially from the boat and, went to work in the Lions Match Factory or wherever else they found some kind of job to keep them afloat while they tried to get up on their 2 feet, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, I found some addresses, again, from 1937. I just chose the year, right, thinking before the war area, and rooms for rent were ready, for example, at West 605 West 137th Street, West 144th Street, West 136th Street, West 152nd Street. Pochinyanov Doctor, 1928, 124th Street. Garage available at West 134th Street. Here's something interesting.
How much were the rents, by the way? Does it say?
No, not always, right? But it doesn't matter. So look, get this, right? I found this interesting. 1931, the Ruski Narodny Center, which was located at West 124th Street.
Wow. I mean, this is already not Hamilton Heights. This is the eastern, part of Harlem, the lower eastern part of Harlem.
And this was the early Russians.
What we can now leap into is who are some of the interesting people that lived in those areas. And we have one person who you actually knew, Teliatnikow, the photographer, Nikolai Teliatnikow, photographer who is probably the most best-known photographer of Russian emigres in the metropolitan area here. He's the official photographer of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. And many of us emigre descendants have his photographs somewhere in our albums.
Somewhere among the grandparents, parents, and so on. Yeah. So, Dядя Kolya, he was my krestный, that's my godfather. He didn't have any children, along with Titi Lida. And yeah, we lived in the same building at 561 West 141st Street. Dядя Kolya already was taking photos. I guess he saw an opportunity. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know how he got into it. There's no one to ask. But he started taking photos, and eventually you started using his apartment already in the 50s as a studio. And he had a small little room where he had everything set up, all the studio lights and so on.
And he had a dark room.
But and I used to go in there, and he had a small little, one part of his hallway was a dark room.
Right.
Part of his hall was a dark room, and he had the red light in there, and he had the tubs, and he had all the string wire hanging, and he would. So I experienced that as a kid. I remember that because it was cool, something out of the ordinary. What left me more an impression is that in another part of the hallway, he had file cabinets, and for me, I never saw any file cabinets. So as a kid, I was a small little child. I'll be pressing the knobs and opening up the files, and I would see a whole bunch of photographs and articles and paper and everything. And this was, I don't know, there must have been about 10 file cabinets all standing in a row. Dядя Kolya passed away in 1970. Yes, I remember the funeral. Yes, I remember sitting in the kitchen. Yes, I remember the people there, with Titi Lida. So what happened to all those file cabinets? What happened to all those files of photos and articles and newspaper clippings? His photos would also be posted in New York City newspapers, daily news.
Really?
You could find it online. Yeah, they would use his photos.
Wow.
And predominantly, like I would probably say that 90% of his the photos he would take were involved for the Ruskiy Zarubezhye, be it the churches, so Prestolny prazdniki, church feast days, right? Any holiday, any holy day, as I would like to correct everyone. So Pascha, елки, детские елки, школа, русская школа, свадьбы, крещения, and so on and so, birthday parties. He did them all. He was probably the only one. In all the articles I've been looking through Novye Ruskoye Slovo, I didn't find any advertisements for photographers. He did copyright his photographs because in his later years, in his 60s, you could see that there's a copyright stamp just practically on every photo that I have from him. But question is, what happened to the 50,000, 100,000, I don't know, photographs, negative?
That's a very good question. Since he didn't have children, you wonder what
Where
happened.
did it
Because
go?
I think what's important to state here is that these photographs have a tremendous historical value for our Russian community. He was a phenomenal photographer. As a matter of fact, I even recall people who knew him and said that he always knew how to respectfully photograph the divine services, which is very difficult, especially back then. There was flash. It was very difficult to get an image without using flash.
He would know when exactly. Well point.
Yeah, and that was nowadays everyone just sticks out their iPhones at any moment they want. But back in his time, it really did take a lot of discretion not to aggravate the clergy, which was very sensitive about having cameras at services. So
Yes.
He was definitely a very talented man, and his prints are very high quality. He must have used a large format camera. And it's very impressive to see his work. Hopefully one day we'll find out where all of his photographs and negatives are. it would be a tremendous asset to archivists and historians.
So let me just add, just in case. So if you're wondering you'll find his wiki page. That's one thing, right? And the one thing that he did on most of his photos, he had a watermark. It was written in Teliatnikow. And you could still find it, because if you're searching for a photograph, let's say of Metropolit Filaret, or some Vladika and so on from Jordanville and so on, good chances that during the 50s, 60s, that was his photograph done. Absolutely. And you'll see that watermark on the corner there. It was not a professional watermark. It was just a watermark with his name written, literally written, not typed, written.
Right.
So,
again, if somebody's out there who knows anything, holler out. Let us know what happened to Teliatnikow's photographs, what happened to his negatives. I think this is actually an issue that archivists have actually discussed.
And check your parents, grandparents' albums. I'm pretty sure you'll find one or two.
So let's move on. Right now, we discussed Nikolai Teliatnikov. Now, in those days, obviously, we didn't, nobody had YouTube, nobody had Spotify. So if you wanted to listen to your music, you had to buy it from somewhere. And interestingly enough, there was a time when, even though there was a Cold War going on and all of that, you could actually get imported Soviet records of, music, songs, whatever. And many Russian emigres loved getting these recordings. My grandparents had a whole bunch of them. And, there was a record shop in the cellar of 3456 Broadway. It's currently the Harlem cigar shop, but I was actually allowed to go in there and get a video. And that was the place of Vasiliev's record store. So I don't know who Vasiliev was. I just know that he probably lived across the street at 561 Broadway in your building, Kato. And that's all I know about him. But he had that store up until 1964. And on November 7th, which is a date that Russians hold in infamy, it's the date of the Russian Revolution, that store was acquired by a certain Bykov, who is featured in a New Yorker magazine that you found from 1968. At one time, many Russian immigrants lived on Broadway around 140th Street. The only store there now that hints of the once thriving Russian community is the Volga Russian Books and Gift Store, 3456 Broadway. Mr. and Mrs. Artemon Bykov run this shop.
Bykov Artemon Artemovich.
Artemon Artemonovich. That's a tongue twister. All right, so Artemon Artemonovich Bykov run the shop, one of the few places in the United States where books by Russian authors are available. The Bykovs also sell icons, Russian perfume, recordings of Russian music, and matryoshka, the carved wooden dolls that fit one inside the other. They also sell year-round the hand-painted wooded Easter eggs, which Russian Orthodox exchange after church service on Easter. The Bykovs bookstore is sort of a haven for the few Russian Americans still on Upper Broadway. The Bykovs serve as unofficial social workers, helping their friends and neighbors with housing and financial problems. Mr. Bykov speaks almost no English. He sings in the choir of the Russian Holy Father's Church on West 153rd Street. And then it continues on about other Russian establishments that are, of course, no longer there.
If people want to find the article, you could show a link afterwards, right?
What's interesting is in this photograph of Bykov in his store, you see a lot of interesting things here. You see some conservy right below him standing there. And then you see a Gazeta with the name Россия. And then in the very right far corner, you see there's a booklet, I guess, that says Religious Persecution in the USSR. Mm-hmm. Then you see the double-headed eagle at top, right to the right of him up there. So it's very interesting just to get this little snapshot of what is now, now of course it's the Harlem cigar shop, but that's basically who Bykov was. And, it kind of resonated with me because it seems that Bykov was a nice guy. He really tried to help people out, and it was a hard time for many people.
He bought the store from Vasiliev, okay? Artemon Bykov purchased it and opened the store as the Volga Bookshop. And that was on November 7th of 1964. Prior to that, it was Vasiliev, right? Rostislav. Now, what's interesting, I don't know when the store closed. I don't know, right? But I presume because Bykov died November 24th, 1970. So what happened at that point? Probably his wife, in a couple of days or weeks or whatever, decided probably shut it down, because there was already a Puerto Rican, Dominican Republican, minimal Russians living there. Vasiliev, who was the original owner of the store from the 50s, at some point, I don't know when he opened it up, but he lived up to 1988. Bykov died in 1970 at the age of 61.
Right.
And Vasiliev died at the age of 88. So both of them actually interred at Novosibirsk.
By the mid 60s, the crime really started getting bad in that area in particular. But again, throughout the whole city, we know of stories of people that would, they would get mugged. Some people even got knifed. It was really, my grandfather was mugged twice. His apartment was broken into.
Yeah.
So
My grandmother was mugged. No, not she wasn't mugged, but she was robbed, right? So, and that was roughly around 1974.
Right. My grandfather was early 1970, and then finally, my grandparents decided they had to move out, and they went to New Jersey. So that's basically how life went for those people. But it was a long enough period of time for people to become established in America so they can move out to suburbia. And in that sense, it was a very vital transition point to many people. Now, the last person that I'm going to talk about in terms of a business owner is a certain gentleman by the name of Balaklitskiy, who had his supermarket. And a good family friend of ours actually used to make a couple of cents in those days, helping old Russian ladies take their groceries to their apartments. They'd give them a little tip. And so the interesting thing about this store was that you could get some Russian food there. So they would have bread, which came from the Mahopac Church, the Novaya Korennaya Pustin Church up in Mahopac.
Monastyrsky хлеб, right.
Right, which Отец Andrei Popkov mentioned in his interview. Right. And other Russian food, there was, during Pascha, they would have the kulichi, sirная Pascha, kolbasa, and they would have it outside there. You could buy it, straight from the street kind of thing. Really nice ethnic flavor, and that. So we had Balaklitskiy. He was a World War I veteran and a veteran of the anti-communist White Army. We have a very fuzzy photograph from his grave. Maybe someone will be kind enough in the Jackson, New Jersey cemetery to go and take a better picture for us. But yeah, so that's Balaklitskiy and his wife. And he passed away in 1966. And we don't know what happened with the store afterwards. Was it sold to somebody or whatever? It's currently like a 99-cent store. Couldn't get a very good video of it. But that's basically that.
Balaklitskiy was quite known. And his store, and the reason why I'm saying quite known, he still would advertise in the Novoye Ruskoye Slovo, new Russian word, right? He used to have a lot of advertisements, and it seems, for practically for everything. And if it was for Easter, for Pascha, it was interesting to note that he had an advertisement where it said, "Kulichi tam, или там сырная Пасха можно купить для нашей Пасхи или иностранной Пасхи." Right?
That's the Catholic Easter, or the Catholic Protestant
Catholic
Easter.
Easter.
Yeah, interesting. So, as far as Russian business owners, that's the main ones that stand out. Maybe we'll learn about some more if you help us out.
We did, in the sense of, remember the other article, which you might mention, is about the 1968, about Moskva na Hudsonie. I'm sorry, Moskva na Gudsonie, right? Moscow on the Hudson article from 1968, where already people are saying, and it was a very interesting article about how the person who was writing it was saying how things have changed in the area, and that there was a store, a key store on Broadway, which used to advertise ключи, right, keys. Now it's written in Spanish as well. So
interesting. So a couple of other names of people that I just know who lived in that area. So there was a writer who lived on 635 West 141st Street, right by Riverside Drive. The writer Vladimir Nikolaevich Tripolsky, better known by his pen name of Vladimir Ant. And he's from Kiev, and he wrote poetry And there was this one famous Russian emigre painter, this guy Golerbach, who illustrated one of his books. And he wrote a children's book by the name of Malkok Tit about these little acorns, a really cute little book. So he lived there, and he also wrote for the oldest Russian emigre newspaper that I have here, Ruskaya Zhizn, which is still in circulation. We'd really encourage you to take interest in it. And, well, you can like it, but if you want to have a personal subscription to this, it's a great idea to reach out. Wonderful newspaper, still available in print. Very good article on Russian-American relations here during the American Civil War. Highly recommend. So,
And add to that, right? If you have parents or grandparents still around, they might be interested in that newspaper. Give them
absolutely.
A holiday cheer.
So Vladimir Ant used to write a lot for them as well. And speaking of writers, there was another one who lived in the same building of my grandparents, 3456 Broadway, a Sergei Sergeyevich Maksimov, who was also from the second wave of emigres. And he wrote a novel, Denis Bushuev. So he was another person that my grandparents knew. And then there was an interesting person that is a family friend of ours who, is not someone who wrote anything or anything like that, but he's very interesting because he became a monastic. He was a very good friend of my father's. Отец Ian Melander, before his tonsor, he was known as Igor Melander, and he was a Russian monk in the holy mountain of Athos, Saint Panteleimon Russian monastery that's in the Mount Athos monastery in Greece. I'm sure there are a lot of other interesting people that we didn't recognize. We don't know about them yet. Maybe you'll let us know in the comments. Who do you know out there who stood out in the Russian community? We want to have a dialogue. We want to have a discussion. So please write to us. I know it seems a little scary when there's not a lot of comments out there or any comments, but hey, be the first one. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to talk to you.
Comment below the videos. Email us. If you want to, just signal us somehow, and we'll connect with you. But as we're developing this podcast, there's a lot of interesting subjects, and we're getting interesting suggestions as to what we should be covering, and we will be. And sharing the video, it's actually very important, with your brothers, sisters, cousins, so on down the line.
Grandparents, great-grandparents.
If they are on YouTube, and if they're
your neighbors. All right, everybody. We'll see you on the next podcast. Thank you very much for joining us.
Спасибо вам большое. Nice seeing you. Don't forget, subscribe and like it.